Hello and welcome to this discussion about supporting staff at hearings. I'm Sion Davies, a legal director here in the team at Hill Dickinson, and I'm joined today by Dr. Clare Bullen-Foster, a consultant clinical psychologist, someone who I've had the pleasure of working with and someone who I know to be a very good witness on the stand. Hello, Clare.
Hi, Sean. Thank you for having me. As you said, I'm a consultant clinical psychologist. I've worked in the NHS for over 20 years. I've worked within clinical services with NHS Trust. I currently work as a clinical lead for NHS England. And as you've said, I've got experience of conducting serious incident reviews, preparing action plans, implementing learning following inquest, as well as being a trust witness and also providing support to our staff witnesses throughout that process. I'm also CEO of a company called Elios. We provide psychological support to organisations and their staff via clinical support, training, consultation, clinical strategy and debrief. We work really closely with organisations where staff work in situations where they are regularly exposed to traumatic events, and we can provide preventative and responsive support for wellbeing and resilience.
It's fair to say then, Clare, you're a courtroom veteran.
Something like that, maybe.
I'm going to be asking Clare a series of questions to get her insights both as a witness and clinical psychologist. We'll follow the structured format dealing with the debrief and immediately post-incident, the building up to the hearing, focusing on the inquest process, the hearing itself, and staff support in that post-hearing phase. So, post-incident, what does a good debrief look like? What should be included in that discussion? And in your experience, Clare, is it beneficial in setting up staff for what's to come?
I think with debrief and post-incident, in that immediacy, I think there are different layers to a debrief response. In the initial days, maybe even the hours after an incident has occurred, there will need to be a layer of almost like a mechanical or an operational debrief that takes place with staff. Ideally, that is led by somebody who is a senior person, but somebody who is well known to the team or the service, the area where the incident has occurred. Essentially, that debrief is an opportunity to almost go through the timeline of what's happened. It's an opportunity to do that initial fact finding and check-in. And importantly, at that stage, also checking in around the welfare of staff. There will be specific things that need to take place around the documentation and whether immediate actions have taken place in order to support the ongoing safety of, if it's in a healthcare setting, any patients related to that area. I think what's important at this stage is it's the beginnings and the opening of a conversation about how that team, how those individuals in that team are experiencing things following that incident. It gives chance for the staff in a hopefully a supportive peer-led environment to start to express how they're feeling about what's happened and to also achieve some sort of normalization about their experiences, because it is likely that in that immediate aftermath, staff will be distressed and they may be experiencing, quite significant symptoms of anxiety at that point, because that has just happened. It's in that immediate context. I think what's really helpful at that point as well, away from the mechanics of the what has happened and why it's happened and what we need to do next as an organisation, it then allows the senior member of staff to be able to start to provide support to the team and to individuals, signposting them, providing them with the lines of inquiry for them to go down around line management support or occupational health, as it might be. And essentially what I think is most important at that point is that they start to lay the groundwork for what happens next. It's important that staff feel prepared, that there will be an investigation, there will be a report and a review of what has happened. And essentially there are no surprises thereafter for staff involved in this process. And I think that's the greatest benefit in those early stages, so that people have really clear expectations about what's happening and why it's happening. I think it's always about watchful waiting with a team. You might find people, generally speaking, get back into their normal working context in a quite quick way. And they do rely upon the staff and the support that they have amongst their colleagues. In my experience, a follow-up is really helpful. And say within the first 6 to 8 weeks after an incident, so not immediately afterwards, but in those, months, 6 weeks to 8 weeks after an incident has happened, a psychologically led debrief can be very helpful for staff. This would be facilitated by somebody who has got expertise in that area. It doesn't have to be a psychologist, but it's a psychologically informed process. It's somebody who is more neutral to the team, perhaps someone who's a little bit more independent, but where there is a trusted relationship. Trusted doesn't have to be familiar to that team, seeing day in, day out, but just this is somebody who's an expert in this and we're going to go to them for this support is enough for that team to feel secure in that. This is quite different to that operational debrief. This is something more about reflection. It provides the opportunity for the team to be able to discuss what has happened in a very different way. So having somebody who is independent from the team is really helpful because they can also be reflective with the team and quite objective rather than personalising what's happened. In these situations, the facilitator would need to have a really good understanding of what's happened in the team and be able to almost understand, to be able to set the scene to what this is why the debrief is taking place. And as I said, it's then that opportunity for the team to safely share their experiences, what has been difficult, what has been challenging. That might be on a personal level, an individual level, that they have found or experienced something to be quite challenging, or that the team have. But then very importantly, what has been successful, what has gone well. And that could be things such as we've all come together, we've all supported each other, we've done everything that's been asked of us, we've been able to share our concerns, we've provided follow-up to the family at this stage as is appropriate, and we've considered all of those aspects of care for the ongoing nature of the family's needs. And at the end of the debrief, the facilitator will then be in a position to reflect back what that team have spoken about, be that at individual or team level. They're there throughout that process to validate what they've experienced. That might be about providing information about symptoms that they've experienced. People might share that they've struggled with sleep, that they've struggled with anxiety. They might have struggled to come back to their place of work where this event has happened. So the facilitator being experienced in this area, they're able to then provide information about self-care and understand this is normal, and also be able to give important advice as this is maybe when more support is needed for you, and importantly, how to access it.
It's an interesting idea having essentially more than one. So as you say, an operational debrief immediately following the incident, and then one perhaps a little bit later after the dust has settled. I think, in my experience, what most organisations do is have that initial one immediately post-incident and then leave that door open. But then that, of course, places the onus on the individual to come out and seek help rather than have that planned second follow-up.
I think that's true. I think that that's probably a lot to do with time pressure in organisations. But I think whilst, yes, of course, it takes time, and it's whether an organisation has that internal resource or they need to go external to find that support as well. But it's an investment. It's an investment in your team. It's an investment in your staff. And it's an investment in the process that essentially they're having to follow in terms of going to inquest through that process as well.
And that leads us on to our second question. The RCA, the SUI, the Serious Investigation Report. You've already said that a good debrief would perhaps give staff a heads up about this and that it's coming. My question is, what involvement should staff have in that process, if any? Should they just see the report at the end of the process? Again, from personal experience, I quite often find that at a pre-meeting, I'm the one that's sharing that RCA, SUI with staff for the first time. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's challenging, I think, for busy teams and the timeline around an investigation and the necessities to have reports completed within discrete periods of time. For me, a team or a member of staff who have experienced the incident that the report is then about, wherever possible, for them to be as involved as is possible in that process is going to be helpful. Of course, there might be constraints on that around availability of staff, and equally there might be HR processes that are sitting around this as well. So if a staff member has sadly gone off sick after an incident, obviously we would need to be very respectful of that. Staff are interviewed as part of the fact finding and the review. I think it's something about how that reviewer conducts that process. So it can be very transactional. I need to interview you to find out about what has happened. But actually, there's a wealth of information from staff that reviewers can lean upon as part of their review process, that then in turn allows staff to feel quite validated, that they've been heard and that they've been able to contribute beyond just, I was here, this happened, this is what I saw, this is what I did. So it's not just process driven. It's not just about the getting the information report. It's a real contribution that staff can make. So that's not so much about time. That's about an approach maybe to the RCA, to the investigative process that organisations might want to consider adopting. I would expect, and certainly my experience is, that you would have senior leaders from that team closely connected with the reviewer, providing input throughout that process. And so whilst it's probably highly unlikely that draft after draft of a report is able to be shared with a team, that team leader, that senior person within that team, really should be quite aware about where that review is up to, what's happening next, equally what's been identified in that investigation report so far, what's popping up as those areas of learning, what is going to be the action plan. And if they can feed that into the team through general meetings that they have, update meetings on the investigation, or just their usual forums, then that means that when that report is complete, it isn't a surprise to those members of staff, that they're clearly aware of what has been drip fed through that process to them. So by the time you as a solicitor then, Sion, would get to that pre-meet, that action plan really, from an organisational perspective, part of that you would expect that to be starting to be embedded within the services. And so staff will be aware of why that's happening and where this learning has come from and where these actions have been suggested from. So that first pre-meet, really, I would think it would be a real shame if that was where staff did hear about the outcome of that investigation. I don't think it's very helpful. So it's clearly going to be really challenging for you as a solicitor to be that person to deliver that information. And I guess if we follow a process throughout that review of, as I've said from the beginning, that involvement, the way the interviews are conducted and the fact finding is completed, and that dripping into the team, really by the time you're face to face with those staff members, it really should be something that they're very much aware of.
I suppose it also might be the case that a serious investigation report delivered cold by the solicitor might feel quite punitive for staff, particularly, as you say, if they've not had that foresight about what might be coming or included in that report.
Yeah, I think no matter, I mean, I know you well, and I think no matter how well you know somebody, when you know that the legal team are coming in, that is going to have connotations attached to it for that person. And equally, even though this might be a very different circumstances, if they've been through a process like that before and possibly not had a great experience, that will influence how they feel about you walking through the door, no matter how you present that. So I think there is a lot that would make it feel quite difficult if you were providing that information. Staff might feel quite blindsided that, that they don't really know why they're there at that pre-meet. But if they've got that context sitting behind it, as this incident happened, we know this is what has been found, we know this is the learning, we know that there's a process that we need to now go forward, and I'm part of that process, that pre-meet, I would expect then that pre-meet will go much better for you as a solicitor as well as for the team members.
Thanks, Claire. You've also explained some of the looks I've perhaps had over the years when I've walked into rooms.
Maybe so.
I think the process you've described is a really good one, but some of our clients, perhaps in particular our NHS clients, who are beholden to NHS England's strict timescales and also, of course, coronial pressure, might say that that system perhaps isn't workable. But am I right in thinking your answer isn't they should see, and I think you've explained it clearly, they shouldn't see every single draft, but linking in with those team leaders can then drip feed what is in that report to the staff so that when it does get produced and shared with them, there are no surprises.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Having worked in the NHS, still working in the NHS, we are under considerable pressure for many different things, and this is such an important thing to get right. And clearly there's no moving of deadlines when it comes to this process, and that's really important that we're realistic. I guess my answer to that initial question was, rather than it being let's add to that process, it's let's adjust how we do the current process. So perhaps it's a slight change in approach from a reviewer's perspective as to how they go into those interviews with staff and how staff therefore feel through that process. And perhaps it's rather than maybe the team leader carrying that weight on their shoulder to be that point of contact, to be discussing consistently where that report is up to. Perhaps it's about the team leader just knowing this is something you can share. You know, it's not a done deal. It's not the completed product. There will be additions and adjustments to it, but this is where we're up to, and they can provide that information to the staff just through their normal forums. The only thing that it might mean realistically for teams and for the NHS organisations is perhaps around the coordination of that report. So the investigators are clearly under lots of time pressures as well, particularly on big reviews where they've got a lot of staff that they need to ask questions of and documents that they need to review. But maybe that's just about scheduling regular catch-ups as part of that process. That might be an additional piece of work for sure, but sometimes even just the email to keep people updated, that can be enough.
We know that staff can be waiting a long time between interaction. So it might be that the investigation report is being done in the background, or it might be that the investigation report is complete and then the next stage is the actual hearing itself. There is perhaps inevitably then a wait period for staff, which can feel like a burden. What support would you recommend is offered during this wait time?
I think this one comes and reflects back a lot of what we've just been speaking about with the previous question, and it's something about the leadership that sits around the process of investigations and inquest within the organisation maybe. Having been part of inquest, I think it's important that updates come regularly into the team, into those members of staff who have been asked to provide statements and potentially are likely to be at inquest as witnesses as well. And as daft as it may seem, an update to say there's no update is just as important sometimes as this is the update, this is where we are up to. It's really very, very unhelpful for staff to feel as though dates come and they're not been prepared for it. They've not been aware that that's looming. And just wherever possible that we can make sure that staff are prepared through that process. As you said, it can be a long time. It might be months that people are waiting. But if we accept that probably within that time, that member of staff is thinking about this consistently or at different times, and they are worrying about what's happening next, the more that we can keep people prepared just through that information sharing is very, very helpful. There are lots of things beyond that leadership support that an organisation might want to think to put in place. Certainly going back to thinking about those initial stages after the incident have occurred, peer support is incredibly helpful. I think it's more powerful than professional support a lot of the time, because you are taking from those people that you work side by side, who've experienced the same as you, maybe not this time, but have been there and probably walk in the same shoes. So encouraging that, team managers supporting that, facilitating that, using team meetings to make sure that people feel that there's just a check-in. How are people doing? How are people feeling about this? Where this is up to? Then moving on to things like knowing that those individuals who are perhaps more involved have access to one-to-one support from line managers, preparing people on practical levels with reviewing their statements, maybe making sure that if they want to make sure that they want to speak to somebody about their statement, that can be facilitated, so knowing who to go to for support. I think, although I don't think it happens regularly, I think having a network of people who are peers and prepared to speak to their colleagues about, I've been through inquest, this is what it's like, I know it feels this way, so that you've got that real personal validation of what you're experiencing, again, from a colleague who's been there and done what you're experiencing. Organisations hopefully will have formal support systems in place. Occupational health is clearly a really good and obvious place to access support. They can either provide that emotional support on site through their services, or they can signpost if it needs to be something external. Sometimes organisations, if they haven't got that in-house, they will commission external providers to support the teams following serious incidents or even through this process and preparing for inquest. In my experience, the concerns that staff have are, how am I going to manage this weight? How am I going to manage my anxiety through that weight? Now, that is likely to have periods of peaks and troughs through that process. A person is not going to be as anxious as they are immediately after for the duration of time, but certainly there'll be milestones where that anxiety peaks. So it's making sure in and around those milestones. So you mentioned before about pre-meet, Sean, or it might be, right, we need to review your statement. They'll worry why. So what is the support around that we can make sure they go into that meeting or that conversation as prepared as possible and come away from it with support as well. So yeah, the ability for somebody to manage their anxiety throughout that, as well as up to the day of inquest. Often staff are extremely worried about how they're going to feel when they see the family, how they're going to react. That's a real worry for teams and staff. And often they worry, I want to show how I really do feel about this. I want to show my compassion and my empathy towards the family, but I know I need to be professional. This is a formal process that I'm going through. I equally don't want to appear cold and uncaring. I think whatever the concerns are of staff, the fundamental principle here for organisations, for leaders within that process, are the more we can emotionally support and prepare our staff for this process and during that process, the less traumatic it will be for them overall. And importantly, the better they'll feel when they do get to that day, and the more able they are to prepare and deliver their evidence for the family as they wish to.
The next step in that process is then the pre-meeting with the organisation solicitor, the external solicitor, the member of HR, whoever holds the ring within that organisation. My question to you is, and something I'm often asked, is how can staff be made to feel less anxious or better prepared during these? Because of course, and as you've already covered, being told that, right, the solicitor would like a meeting with you is in itself going to create a high degree of anxiety.
I know I'm probably repeating myself, but I guess if that process has been managed, there won't be any surprises that this is going to happen and the reasons for why it's going to happen. But appreciating that it's likely to still create anxiety nonetheless, and probably they won't have met you before, they won't have met a solicitor in that kind of a context before. I think if it's possible, and appreciate it's time for yourself and colleagues, but being able to just have an informal, hi, I'm Sean, I'm the trust solicitor, we're going to meet in a couple of weeks' time. I've got 10 minutes for a quick Teams chat, if that's helpful, or this is my email if there's anything at all that you want to ask before that. I think that's a nice introduction, that's a nice informal approach in, so that somebody is aware of what your name is. If they do take up that offer of that 10-minute call, they'll know who you are, they'll put a name and a face together. So it's broken the ice somewhat, really. It's not going into that coldly, because sorry.
I find, and I entirely agree with you, I find that it's the soft skills that matter.
Yeah.
As you say, it's perhaps not going in with a blank face, but perhaps smiling now and again, letting them know it's okay. Yeah. And also it's the small stuff that matters to them, letting them know perhaps not just about the legal aspects of the case, but the interpersonal stuff they want to know. And what's most pressing to them, I find, is What do they wear on the day?
Yeah.
Where do they turn up? Where do they meet me?
Absolutely, yeah. So those conversations, those questions, they might not feel able to ask in that meeting, but if you do that sort of intro and it might be in an email they feel more comfortable to ask, then certainly those things are going to be helpful. You might be very familiar with the trust and leaders within the trust might be really familiar with you, but for this member of staff, it's probably the first time that you've met. So I think that opportunity to do a bit of a pre-meet prior to the pre-meet, if that makes sense. I think that's a really helpful strategy. But again, if that's been well managed by the trust throughout, from the moment of incident occurring, or by the organisation of any kind for that matter, then the staff member is more likely to feel comfortable going into that meeting in any case. Things like giving them the opportunity to have a colleague come with them, or making sure their team manager or that senior lead is available to come with them. They may not want to, but at least it's offered. Hopefully they will be familiar with the review. Like we said earlier, it won't be something that you are presenting to them at that time for the first time. Their awareness of what happens next and being able to think about, as you've just described there, an opportunity to express, well, this is what I'm really anxious about on the day. That makes it more likely that you're going to have a better experience as a witness if you can have that opportunity to share some of those concerns. I then think it's really important that after that pre-meet, the lines of communication remain open. That might not be directly with you, Sean. Appreciate it might not be a direct line through to the solicitor. There might be appropriate channels of communication through the investigation team or through the line management, whatever it needs to be. But knowing that if there's any follow-up questions, that they can make that contact with you before the day of the inquest. I think, again, that's really important as well.
Moving on to the hearing itself, I'm going to roll two questions into one, something I'm often shouted at by coroners for doing. But what feelings will the witness typically be feeling on the morning of? And what will they be feeling in the courtroom? I suppose I'm asking you is what's normal? What should they and what can they expect to be feeling? And then how do we manage that?
Yeah, I think they're really important questions. And my answers to this are, as a psychologist and understanding how people are likely to feel, but I'm sharing my experiences with this as well, and how I have felt. So it is so understandable that they will be feeling anxious on the day, apprehensive. They have probably waited a long time and waited in anticipation for this. It's likely to be the first time that they have seen the family since the incident, if at all, after the incident has happened. And as I've mentioned, that is more than likely the thing that they are most anxious about. So the enormity of the day, I don't think that can be underestimated for anybody. You know, even somebody who has been through that process again, or I've attended in different forms, you know, and as a senior lead and as a clinician, it doesn't really change how you feel. It's the fact that you're there to be for the purposes of what the inquest is, that's the overriding sense of anxiety, I think, from my experience anyway. For many people, certainly myself at the beginnings of my journey in the world of inquest, it was the first time I'd been in a courtroom. I'd never been in that kind of a setting before, and I think there's something about a courtroom, a formal setup, that is daunting in itself. The important thing, I think, as well, Sean, is to take into account that, as well as all of this being anticipated for a long time, we are placing staff in a position where they are there to talk about something that has been extremely traumatic for them, perhaps something that it defines maybe the most traumatic event they've ever experienced in their life, or certainly in their working life. They might have struggled with that. We might be speaking about people here who have struggled with anxiety through that process. They may have had time off sick, we don't know, but that's important to take into account as well. And they also are aware it's likely to be, for the family, one of the most traumatic experiences that there to hear about as well, you know, to hear about how their family member has come to some kind of harm. The staff member will be fully aware of that. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge just how big it is for staff, at the same time as also normalizing it's okay to feel that way. It's a normal and understandable way to feel, and it's for all of these reasons of how important it is to you that you're likely to experience that level of anxiety and trepidation. In terms of the courtroom, again, I've said that just before. I think the formality of it can be really, that sense of enormity can really come across in that environment. And for many, it will be the first time they've been in that situation. It's the magnitude of what it represents, I think, that's really important to consider here. For many of us, in anticipation of events, we'll imagine things. So we might have in our mind's eye what that's going to look like, how it's going to feel. It might not live up to that expectation at all. For some, that might be great. It might not look as scary as they imagined it to. But for others, it might be so far away from their expectation. It might be bigger than they expected it to be. That could actually unsettle them on the day as well. So we need to think about supporting people at that time when they are in what is likely to be the first time they've experienced something like that.
So how can we, and by we I mean me as a solicitor and you perhaps as a senior staff member, assist witnesses in easing that anxiety and those feelings of trepidation?
I think for organisations, and this might sound like it's quite a big ask, but I think if we have services and teams that are, sadly, through the nature of their business, likely to at some point in their career experience a serious incident and possibly a coronial and inquest process, I think it's a very good and proactive way to manage that anxiety by actually, as part of their learning and their experience opportunities for staff, to give staff the chance to attend an inquest, obviously not one that they are a witness at, and if at all possible, prior to them ever needing to be there as a witness, not in sort of the timeline of them going to inquest themselves. So where it's quite a neutral experience for the staff member to be able to go along for an observation. And that's about them learning and understanding the process, some of the what it might look like, how formal it is, what people ask, how people dress, those kind of things, you know, so that they've got all of those practical things in their mind at a neutral time for them, where they're not worrying about, well, my inquest is coming up, or anything like that, for that pressure. So I think if that's something that can be facilitated by organisations and solicitors, I think as a learning process, that's really helpful as a proactive approach. When we are in that timeline for that staff member, practical support from the organisation, I think is absolutely fundamental. So never allowing that staff member to attend that inquest alone has to be the absolute number one thing for me, as somebody who's been there and also someone who's supported staff in those situations. So it might be that we give opportunity for the member of staff to choose who they want to go with them. It may be a colleague, it may be a peer, somebody who they really trust. Equally to that, or in addition to that, I should say, for me, there should always be a senior member of staff at inquest, regardless of who's going actually with that member of staff, so that they are on site prior to any witnesses arriving. They are there throughout the day. They are there particularly following those witnesses giving their evidence, to provide just a very, very quick debrief and, are you okay? You did very well. I'll speak with you later. Encouraging staff to have a dry run, so practical things like, where is the venue, where will I park, how long will it take me to get there, if it's a public transport that will be used, how far is it the walk from the train station. Or it might also be that there are arrangements made for people to be taken so that they don't have to drive or worry about travel arrangements. We can't underestimate those kind of things of support. Equally, a cup of tea when you arrive, a bottle of water. if their evidence is occurring over a lunchtime period, making sure that somebody goes and grabs lunch for them. It's all part and parcel really of that member of staff feeling that they are supported, that they are around a team of individuals who are supporting them and to help them feel at ease. I think for the solicitors, yourselves in that role, wherever possible, giving the opportunity for the member of staff to be able to go and look inside the room. So the venue, either before the date or on the morning of, before people are coming in, being able to see the court set up, see where they will be before they give evidence, where they will need to walk up to and sit in order to give evidence, where the coroner will be seated, where the family and the family solicitors will be seated. Practically, I think making sure that they're aware of what they need to bring with them on the day. So will they be provided with copies of their statements or other documents that may need to rely upon? Will they have access to that? Are they expected to bring it? Some formalities around, so taking an oath or affirming, people probably haven't ever experienced that. They may not know what the difference is. So maybe just some information beforehand to let them know that is a formality that they will need to adhere to, and what would be their preference for them to think about. And then I think after the event, and this goes back to when we have worked together as well, Sean, really, that feedback at the end of the day is so helpful. That independent roundup of this is how things have gone today, this is what's been discussed, we heard from this person, the evidence was well received. However it feels appropriate at that stage to be able to give any form of validation and reassurance to that staff member, we can't underestimate that is literally what they're waiting for. They're likely to want to leave that courtroom, that building as quickly as possible after they've given evidence, and that's understandable. But they will be wanting to know, did I do okay? Was everything okay that I have given today? Is it given the family what they needed? And if there's anything that a solicitor can provide just as a brief roundup, I think that is really, really important. And I personally found that very, very helpful on inquests that we've worked on as well.
I think, as you say, then it's again the little things that go a long way. I think what I and my colleagues try to do is encourage witnesses to get there an hour earlier than the start time, which is normally 10 o'clock. And that gives us a chance, as you say, to sit down, have a cup of tea. They can ask any more questions they may have. But again, in the build-up, they will have been sent, hopefully, a witness information pack with a guide of, as you say, what to expect, what to call the coroner. It's all these little things that go beyond the legalities, which actually really matter to witnesses.
It absolutely does. And I think we're all human, aren't we? And if we're experiencing something for the first time, the one thing that we want to be is prepared. Nobody is appreciative of surprises generally in those kind of situations. So I think wherever possible for an organisation such as yourselves to provide practical information and if it can come in the form of a pack, with these kind of tips and information and perhaps things that you've learned along the way as a solicitor and from people you've worked with as well, things that you know have worked well for others, that's going to be really, really valuable. It's for all of us. It's a sense of feeling prepared and to an extent feeling in control of what is likely to be a very anxiety-provoking situation, for the reasons that we've said around re-experiencing something very, very traumatic, all the way along to the formalities and the legalities of what they're exposed to probably for the first time. So wherever possible, those small matters are actually huge for people, and probably if we took feedback from people afterwards, it's probably the things that they remember the most.
And finally, Claire, the debrief. What should happen during a debrief? What should be asked? And my main question, purely from a personal and selfish perspective, perhaps, should the solicitor be there? I often feel quite conflicted. Some organisations will ask me to attend the debrief, but I sometimes fear that for the witness, that might feel like an extension of the courtroom beyond the conclusion of the actual hearing.
I think it's a really important question and probably quite a dilemma. And my guess is that there will be different people who will experience things differently about this or have different views. again, like the initial debrief after the incident has happened, I think it's about understanding that there are probably different functions to this debrief post-inquest as well. So for me, as a psychologist, but also as a person who's lived and breathed this experience as well, the importance of that psychologically facilitated debrief is really important. It's an opportunity again for those staff who've been involved to speak openly and freely, to some extent after the anxiety has gone now, because the actual anticipation of the inquest, it's happened. But it allows them the time and the space really to be able to speak openly and think in conjunction with their peers and colleagues what they found most challenging about that, how they felt prior to, how they felt during that process, how they felt in the moments after, and then, you know, maybe a week or two have passed after at this point that we're having this post-inquest debrief. Like with the initial debrief, the important part is the balance. So what went well? It's really helpful for people after an experience that they have found to be difficult, distressing, traumatic, that they are able to reflect upon despite the anticipation that they had, what was the reality of that? Actually, the time to be able to say, do you know what, I made myself so anxious in the anticipation and the build up for it, but you know what, actually, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. It allows that whole opportunity to process all aspects of it. And that means that as a team, as individuals, they're supporting each other, they're providing that validation. Other people will likely say, yeah, God, I was really, really anxious before and afterwards. I couldn't wait to get away. But on reflection, actually, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. And you get that reassurance from the leadership team as well that sits around that set of staff. It means, importantly, that if staff unfortunately are ever in that experience again, they have got something tangible to relate back to in their memory, in their experience, that where they can say, it's not nice, it's not pleasant, it will always carry that anxiety because of the enormity of what it represents. But I can do it, and I have done it, and I know what to expect now. And that will be supportive for that future process. In the nicest possible way, I think that probably does need to happen without the solicitor there, because I think that's more about the team and staff as individuals having that safe place to do that. Not that the solicitors being there would make it unsafe, but it just means it's much more of an open environment, I think, for them to have that conversation more freely. Where I think, in my view, the solicitor is important to be part of it. It then goes back to the outcomes. What has happened as a consequence of that inquest? What are the actions to take forward? What's the learning? And to be fair to myself and other leaders in organisations, we probably won't understand to the depths that you will as a solicitor some of those parts, and we will defer to you to explain some of those things. So to have you there as a resource is hugely valuable, selfishly from our point of view. I think it's about knowing that the staff are likely to maybe have some questions about that as well. But if you're there to talk through about, this is the outcome, this is the why and the what next, you can deliver that quite objectively as a solicitor and then give that space for that question.
So I suppose there's some merit in having it split. So you might have an hour-long debrief. Maybe the solicitor is invited for the first 15 minutes to answer any of those legal questions that might arise. What was the outcome? What does it mean for us? Mm-hmm. And then I go away, and that safe space, as you say, is perhaps better facilitated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to do it. I think and when I run debriefs myself, if I've come in as an external person to that team, I will split it as well in such a way as to give a bit of breathing space to allow that team to almost, after you've left, after I've left, to sort of debrief again on how that experience was as well. So I think again, a layered approach to it is really helpful. And it might be, as you've said there, if actually you're part of the beginning of that process, it allows that discussion about the information you've delivered to take place then in that safe space between them as colleagues. as opposed to you coming back at a later date or tagging on to the end of that psychological aspect of the debrief. It allows those parts that you've talked through to also be part of the conversation they have.
And something else that perhaps we should also acknowledge is that not everyone wants to feed back as part of a group. And you've actually helped Hill Dickinson in producing an automated inquest questionnaire, which we send out following the conclusion of every inquest. And again, it's not compulsory to fill out, but it does give staff, doesn't it, that opportunity, perhaps in the quietness of their own home or in their offices, simply to write how they felt, for the benefit of future witnesses.
Absolutely. And the learning of the organisation that they're from, and the learning of your organisation and your team as solicitors who provide that support. I think that's an opportunity. You're quite right. Debrief should never be an enforced experience for anybody. It should be that people feel, if they wish to share, that they can, and that there's that forum to do so. But it should never feel like a compulsory, I must speak at this time. So that opportunity to have that debrief, the feedback after, whether that comes before or after the debrief, but certainly post-inquest, to capture that honest information and perhaps even things that people don't feel able to share with their organisation as openly as they may want to make sure they're aware of. I think that's an opportunity to facilitate that as well. The learning that then can be fed back into organisations, or the learning that you take forward as Hill Dickinson as legal representatives for trust, to say, this is what we find, this is a good way for you to think about working with your staff, or for us to work with you to work with staff. There's something very authentic, I think, about that feedback, and real. It's absolutely in their own words, and the learning, I think, is really, really important.
And I suppose, whilst we've discussed what is essentially generic advice for organisations, it's important to understand and realise that everyone's different, aren't they? That not one size fits all, and that some people may need more or less assistance and support than others. But perhaps to enforce the blanket support isn't going to be in everyone's best interests.
No, that's right. I think support looks different for different people. You're absolutely right. We can't necessarily expect everybody to just follow this linear process in the way that we've talked about it here, and to be okay throughout that. There will be people who manage the whole process very differently to others, either in a way that it doesn't impact as significantly upon them, or for others that are extremely distressed by it. So I think it's an opportunity for us to learn from the diversity of that experience as well. And to think about the support that needs to be available for people, be that within the organisation, be that external, things that people may want to seek for themselves, and equally things that people can do for themselves, to keep themselves well in the preparation for inquest, and particularly in the moments after incident and after the inquest has concluded as well. But that will be very much at an individual level. We can provide a framework, I think, and I think that's what we're talking about here, isn't it? It's the opportunity to be able to talk about what best practice looks like, and that framework for people to consider in an organisation how to implement some of these aspects of best practice, but also at the same time understanding that our staff are individual people, and therefore we might need to do different things for different people.
We've talked a lot about internal sources of support. Can you assist in perhaps listing or informing us about other sources of support outside of an organisation which may be available to a witness?
Absolutely. I think before doing that, I think it's just to reiterate the point around the normality of these feelings that we've talked about as well, that it is really going to be expected and understandable that people will struggle emotionally after an incident has happened. We've covered the whole course of the process here, and clearly it started with something significant and traumatic and very, very distressing happening in for the members of staff, and obviously for the family and the individuals concerned. But it's normal to feel anxious, distressed throughout that process. Those feelings are not necessarily problematic. They will be unpleasant, but they're not necessarily problematic. It's really important that during those early stages, particularly, that we monitor ourselves. We know what normal for us looks like and feels like. And so if we notice differences, it's absolutely important we notice them and we take account of them. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there is a problem that's occurring that we need to seek further support for. Equally, we can do lots of things to help ourselves. So throughout this process, particularly in the weeks leading up to the inquest, self-care strategies, making sure that we have a good sleep routine, keeping our physical activities up, keeping in contact with things that give us pleasure, our social contacts, our social activities and our networks of support are incredibly helpful. So whilst formal support is available, I think it's really important we don't underestimate our own networks and our own resilience and strategies that we can use. There are various forms of support within organisations, but I guess the type of support might vary depending upon the organisation. So from a mental health trust perspective or healthcare in general, we might be more equipped with our occupational health support offer. It may be that isn't the case for other organisations that find themselves part of an inquest process. Equally, even if there is in-house support, a person who's involved in this may not want to go through those routes. They may want to seek an independent support. Of course, GPs are a front line of support and resource, but again, it might not feel as though that's what people want to go for. It may not feel that they want to go and actually put that on record. So there are organisations like ourselves that facilitate welfare support and welfare packages for individuals or for organisations. In preparation for dealing with these kind of things, there are organisations who can provide mental health training and support so that people who are faced with these kind of situations, they know what to do if and when they are experiencing difficulties through this process. We provide psychological debrief, responses to incidents or in key timelines. But in all cases, no matter where that organisation takes that support from, or those staff members want to seek support, the most important is if we can do things preventatively, if we can do things in preparation for having to be in this sort of a situation, we're more likely to have a better outcome as a staff member or for an organisation. So wherever possible, embedding an approach that's really responsive to the needs of staff, talking about the fact that different staff will need different things, but where they are more likely to be exposed to situations like this, that is going to be of the greatest benefit.
Thank you, Claire. That's really helpful. And thank you for joining me and Hill Dickinson in this discussion. My hope, and I'm sure it's yours, Claire, is that this will benefit organisations in providing support to witnesses, and also witnesses in where to seek that support and also what it should look like. If you do have any questions, there are details on the screen below. Thank you.